I'm Henry Fortunato, Director of Public Affairs, and tonight, well, actually every night, but tonight especially, a loyal member of the Jayhawk tribe. Not a bad thing to be when all of tonight's presenters are KU professors. I was in the grad school class of '07. Appearances notwithstanding, let me make clear that was 2007, not 1907. So, you know, on the bus this morning, I heard a woman say, "I can't believe it's been 50 years. She was, of course, talking to herself, like many of the people I ride the bus with. But her point was valid nonetheless. For those of us of a certain generation, it does boggle the mind that President Kennedy was assassinated a half-century ago today. I remember quite clearly the moment I heard the news, as I suspect many of you here tonight do as well. That day in Dallas ranks as one of the most traumatic events in American history. And even though it has been studied and analyzed and commented upon seemingly ad infinitum, as KU History Department Chair Jeff Moran noted in an op-ed in the Kansas City Star just the other day, there's still a need, he said, to help dispel the haze, if not the gloom, of this national ordeal. To do that, Jeff has convened a panel of KU historians whom we are about to hear tonight. And to tell you more about that and who they are and what they're going to talk about, I want to introduce Danny Anderson, the Dean of KU's College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, which, by the way, is the largest and most diverse school on Mount Oread. The departments of the college cover subjects spanning the humanities, arts, social and behavioral sciences, natural sciences, math, and international studies. As Dean, Danny is dedicated to sharing this breadth of knowledge outside the boundaries of campus, which in many ways is why KU is here tonight at the Kansas City Public Library. So, please help me in welcoming Dean Anderson for the formal introduction of tonight's program.
Thank you, Henry, for the introduction. I also want to thank the Kansas City Public Library for their partnership with the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at KU. And I also need to recognize the KU Alumni Association. They supported us immensely in organizing this wonderful event. But most importantly, I want to thank all of you for being here on a cold Friday night for a great conversation. This is an incredible turnout. Tonight's panel is part of a regular series of public programs hosted by the college's Department of History. The Pivotal Events in History series exemplifies our mission of learning without boundaries in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. We have a tremendous wealth of knowledge among our faculty across many diverse areas. As a public institution, we strive to share our discoveries and expertise beyond the borders of campus. The varying backgrounds and areas of scholarship of the four historians here tonight will provide a thought-provoking discussion. The assassination of President Kennedy has fascinated a nation for 50 years. Whether we wonder how the nation would have changed if the president had lived, or are intrigued by conspiracy theories, there are endless lenses through which to consider one of the most significant events in recent U.S. history. Before we move to the discussion, I want to tell you just a little bit about each of our panelists. Theodore A. Ted Wilson is a longtime professor of history at KU and the teacher of an estimated 10,000 undergraduates in courses on World War II and American diplomatic and military history. Ted has advised a jaw-dropping 50 students to their PhDs, and they can be found as nearby as the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth and as far away as West Point and Afghanistan. Jennifer Weber teaches a popular course on America's worst presidents, but she is also known as an expert on one of the best. Her well-known book, Copperheads, looks at how Abraham Lincoln dealt with the anti-war Democrats who were his strongest political opponents during the Civil War. Jeffrey Moran is a historian of modern America and chair of the KU History Department. He has advised senior honors theses on such topics as commie hunts at the University of Kansas, socialism in Kansas, battles over urban development, birth control, influenza in the history of medicine, Robert Penn Warren as historian, and numerous other topics. Finally, Jonathan Hagel teaches, among other things, the popular course Sports, Leisure, and Entertainment in America, which travels from Buffalo Bill to Ozzie and Harriet and Mad Men. He is also teaching a course this semester on the 1970s. He is sorry if that makes anyone here feel old, but it also makes him feel old too. Thank you to our panelists. I'm really looking forward to learning more about your viewpoints. So without any further delay, I'll turn this over to Jeff Moran to start our discussion on the Kennedy assassination 50 years later.
I guess I'm wired to move anywhere I want, but I'll use both of these things. I want to second most of what Danny is talking about. Okay. I second most of what Danny is talking about. In particular, thank you for coming out tonight. Thank you to the alumni. Thank you to those of you who did not have the great good fortune to study history at KU over your years. Sorry, but you'll have your chance tonight, I guess, a little bit. As Danny said, this is one installment of the Pivotal Events series. We're doing it sort of fall in Kansas City, spring will be in Lawrence. This coming spring we'll have an event that will focus on the beginning of World War I. And again, we're working on anniversaries here. So when you hear about it, you get the urge to take a short travel down I-70. We'll be waiting for you with a very interesting program at that point as well. I think what we're going to do tonight is, if I can keep the panelists from speaking for less than 50 minutes apiece, we should go, we'll go around for about an hour, a little bit more, and then a half hour of questions, reminiscences, what have you, when we finish up here. So I think it'll be a good program. I have to admit, it's a little awkward to be coming and speaking on the anniversary of an assassination. I would have liked to come to talk about sort of a celebration of a great administration, celebration of a wonderful election, these kinds of things. But the assassination, as many of you know better than I do, was this great traumatic event, and so really hard to avoid. And if you know, obviously this is the 50th anniversary. The original assassination, well, the only assassination, took place on a Friday, November 22nd, 50 years ago. So at this very moment, kind of when we're working through this, Kennedy is being brought back to Washington, or has been brought back to Washington. Lyndon Johnson is working on the transition, moving not just administrators and things, but also furniture, paintings and whatnot. Jack Ruby has shuttered his strip joints for the weekend out of respect for the Kennedy family, and was very angry that a lot of his fellow club owners did not. And Lee Harvey Oswald was being questioned for the second time at the police station in Dallas. Well, so that's kind of the context of what happened 50 years ago for us. Some of you, those of you who were around at the time, remember this sort of traumatic moment, and it took place on a Friday, so you had the entire weekend to sort of watch television. And it was estimated that 96% of households who had televisions were watching significant parts of this. And of course, there were 3 networks at the time, and all 3 networks were showing the aftermath of the assassination. It would have made a great psychological impact anyway. Presidential assassinations are important, but I don't think the assassination of Garfield made such an impact. I don't think the assassination of McKinley made such a national impact. Lincoln might be a different story. But for Kennedy, I think it's not just because it was a televised assassination or a television president. I think Americans saw Kennedy not so much as a bureaucrat, not so much as a politician, but really as a charismatic figure. As a politician and as a president, he was tied to a sense of inspiration, a sense of optimism, a sense, dare I say it, of liberalism, the chance for the federal government to actually have a positive impact on the day-to-day lives of Americans. And so part of what we're thinking about when we come together to talk about his death is the end of this, well, not really the end, but kind of the end of some of this sense of inspiration about what the federal government and any government was capable of doing. But we have to approach this anniversary with more than just mourning and more than just mythology, and that's why we're here tonight. So I don't want to take up the panel's time with more introductory remarks, so I'll sit down and see you in a little while. And our first speaker will be Jennifer Weber. You can see how carefully we've worked this out.
We changed the lineup about 11 times in the last 2 days, so we're all a little confused up here. I'm going to just hope that I don't make this turn off. There. Ah, great. Now I can see everybody, and let me move this out because they got this special wiring on me like Madonna. I promise I won't try to sing. I will make you all flee out of here. Well, I'm here tonight to talk about Lincoln, Kennedy, and the arc of history. As you heard, I'm really more of a Lincoln expert than a Kennedy expert, so this has been a very, very strange week for me. As many of you may know, Tuesday was the 150th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. So I spent the first half of my week talking to lots of people about the Gettysburg Address, and now I'm spending the second half of my week talking about Kennedy's assassination. So I'm feeling a little, I don't know, it induces a lot of weird emotions to be talking about these things really in such close proximity. What I do want to assure you of is that you are not going to be getting a list from me tonight of ways that Lincoln and Kennedy assassinations are similar, or, you know, that Oswald shot him from a warehouse and ran to a theater, and Booth shot Lincoln in a theater and ran to a warehouse. I know that you can buy a plate with all that information on it because I have one. But what I do want to talk tonight about in terms of these two particular assassinations is how history changed or didn't change as a result of these assassinations. I would argue that they're the two most traumatic assassinations, presidential assassinations in American history, although I'm curious if in another 100 years, which I won't be alive for, but maybe some of my students will, how Kennedy's assassination is going to be regarded, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But this is a little dicey territory for a historian because we work in the realm of evidence. We're an evidentiary-based discipline, and much of what I'm going to be talking about tonight is speculative. And so science fiction writers and time traveler aspirants, this is your moment to come forward and argue with me. But I'm going to here go on what their existing track records were and sort of predict a bit about the arc of history. Now, Lincoln's tragedy, I would argue, was and remains to this day one of the greatest tragedies in American history. I think it was devastating for the country, and I think that we are still feeling the effects of it. Lincoln, as many of you may already know, was shot on Good Friday. By Easter Sunday, ministers were getting into the pulpit all across the North, at least, and commemorating the late president as the American Jesus. That was the sense of loss, the dimension of loss that Americans had at the time of Lincoln's assassination. And when I say that we're still feeling the results of this, what I'm talking about are things like a civil rights movement that remains incomplete, a Reconstruction process that in important ways remains incomplete. And I think we all know that neo-Confederates are still out there, alive and well, and still embittered by the events of Reconstruction. Now I'm going to assume a bit of knowledge here that most of you are familiar with the basic outlines of Reconstruction, and that it was an incredibly rocky process, very difficult for everybody involved, white and black, Northerner and Southerner. I do think this would have been quite different under Lincoln. Lincoln had a stated policy, and you see this particularly in his second inaugural address, that he would be firm with the Southerners as they rejoined the Union, but merciful. His idea of malice toward none, I think, would have very much applied in his Reconstruction policies, but he would not have let the Southerners push him around. With his assassination, though, the country got a man, Andrew Johnson, who was most likely an alcoholic, very insecure, and had a chip on his shoulder toward the Southern aristocracy. He was born in North Carolina. He grew up very poor. He was a self-made man, in some ways not terribly different from Lincoln. But he did not have Lincoln's benevolent spirit, and he did not have Lincoln's ability to forgive. And this became a major problem during the Reconstruction process, because his insecurities and his inability to let go of his childhood experiences led him to allow the Southern aristocrats to run all over him. They very quickly figured out that if they begged and pleaded a bit before him, that he would give them pretty much anything they wanted. They just had to humiliate themselves for a few moments, and then they could go on their way. And what their way meant included a series of black codes that all but reinstated slavery in significant portions of the South. As a result of this and other problems, there was a growing argument between Johnson and the Republican-controlled Congress about who should control Reconstruction. And I should say here that Johnson was a Democrat, a Southerner, and somebody who remained loyal to the Union. He was the only Southerner who remained in the United States Senate when his state seceded from the Union. This is why the Republican Party, which renamed itself in 1864 the Union Party, picked him as the vice presidential nominee. It was to show a unity across party lines and across sectional lines. But he did not have a great affinity, it turned out, for the Republican Party, and was not particularly willing to work well with the Republican members of Congress. And so you got this battle over whether Congress or the president should control Reconstruction. The result was that Reconstruction became much harsher toward Southern whites as Congress gained more and more control than it might have been otherwise, making them angrier and more bitter, and resulting in things like the Ku Klux Klan. Whether the Klan would have existed under Lincoln is difficult to say, but I think I can say with a fair degree of certainty that Lincoln never would have allowed something like the black codes to be institutionalized, nor would he roll over for the white Southern elites who would plead to have everything back that they had had before the war. Nor do I think that the Southern whites would have even attempted it with Lincoln. But they saw an easy target in Andrew Johnson, and they were right. Now, by the usual narrative, this whole struggle over Reconstruction and this fight between Congress and the executive branch is capped with Andrew Johnson's impeachment. He escaped removal from office by a single vote in the Senate. What we don't think of here in our discussion about Reconstruction is a silver lining. And so this is how I want to mess with your heads a little bit tonight, is to talk about upsides that we don't often think about. And what I'm going to pitch as the bizarre upside of Lincoln's assassination is the 14th Amendment. At the time, the big news about the 14th Amendment was that it granted citizenship to African Americans. This had been removed by the Dred Scott decision, as some of you may remember. But the 14th Amendment instated that for all African Americans and others born in this country. What people at the time didn't think about much was the clause in the second part of the 14th Amendment about equal protection under the laws. And I call this the stealth amendment because it really went under the radar for a long time, about 75 years. And then with the civil rights movement coming really to fruition in the 1950s, you start seeing the 14th Amendment and this clause cited again and again and again in the pursuit of civil rights. And we're not talking just about African Americans. We're talking about women. We're talking about Latinos. We're talking about Native Americans. And right now, in the paper, every day, just about, we're talking about gays and lesbians. This search for rights. The 14th Amendment in the 20th century becomes the most litigated part of the Constitution, and it's all about civil rights. And we would not have had, I think, the 14th Amendment had Lincoln been in office. There would have been no need for it. You would have had a president who, for the most part, may not have seen completely eye to eye with Congress, but certainly would have been working with them instead of against them, in the way that Andrew Johnson was in opposition with the Congress. So there's your upside to Lincoln's assassination. It's also quite possible in thinking about Lincoln's assassination that he was shot at the moment of his greatest glory and his greatest achievement. I don't think that his legacy would have been materially stained by his participation in Reconstruction, but I think it potentially could have been more difficult than it is now. Reconstruction was hard. It was going to be hard regardless of who was president, but it certainly would have gone better, I think, under Abraham Lincoln. Let's turn to JFK now for a moment. His legacy to me is much more difficult to suss out. Here's a guy who was very bright, very handsome, extremely charming, and had a very attractive family. And I think that assassination cast a heroic veil over him that may not have existed otherwise. What happened after Kennedy was assassinated is within a few short days, the Kennedy myth-making machine went into absolute overdrive. The whole Camelot legacy of this administration was very much constructed by Jackie Kennedy and others in a very tight circle of Kennedy loyalists. I think that it is going to take the baby boomer generation dying out in order to get a really neutral, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry to break that to you. So you won't be able to see the exciting conclusion. But I think that what we see among people who can remember the Kennedy assassination is it's very colored. There's a lot of emotion involved, and I think that we can get a much more neutral assessment of his legacy the farther away we get, and frankly, the fewer baby boomers who are writing the histories of this. People coming in with perhaps a more critical eye. And if anybody wants to, if I need to duck behind this podium, just let me know. But at the time of Kennedy's death, he had, as anybody who has been watching the 1,000 hours of television in the last couple of weeks, I think there's 1 hour for every day he was in office. At least that's what my DVR looks like. But he left a very mixed record. On the negative side, there was the Bay of Pigs, the increasing activity in Vietnam, the Soviet sense of his being green and weak, which was brought on largely by Kennedy himself, his laughable campaign against Castro, which featured exploding tennis balls and cigars, and his, frankly, lack of action on civil rights until June of 1863, so not even 6 months. Welcome to my world. I do this every day, including when I put the dates down myself on my letters. Yeah, it's always the 1800s in my world. So I'm sure you'll have to correct me again on this, so thank you. But he, very, very little in the way of defending civil rights or the civil rights movement until June of 1963. On the plus side, he did stand up to his military advisors and his cabinet in regards to the Cuban Missile Crisis and cut a backroom deal with Nikita Khrushchev on disarming missiles in Turkey. This was an important moment, clearly, in world history, and potentially saved us all from nuclear war. The Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was a real accomplishment, and I don't want to overlook the fact that although he was late to the party, he was starting to come on board with civil rights. I have concerns about his sexual dalliances because I think it posed a national security risk. I think it made him very vulnerable to all kinds of blackmail. And although there's not real evidence that that happened, there's no reason to think that it wouldn't, given, shall we say, his voracious appetites. Now, as is also true with Lincoln and many other presidents, it did take Kennedy time to grow into the job. This is a very hard job. And I think that what we see with Kennedy, and part of the tragedy and the sense of tragedy around Kennedy's assassination is there's a sense that he finally had gotten to understand the reins, how to do this job, that he was just hitting his stride at the very moment that he was cut down. But that also makes it very difficult to assess where he would have gone, because he is so inconsistent. He does leave such a mixed record. It's so difficult to tell. There's not an obvious arc for me as a historian that I can predict reasonably well, even in a way that I feel like I could do so more comfortably with Lincoln, where there was an established track record and a real trajectory to his administration. I will say, in the case of Kennedy, that the silver linings are, I think, frankly, more obvious than they are for Lincoln. And those are the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which, in fact, I have the years written down here correctly, if I had looked down. Whether the Civil Rights Act would have been passed under Kennedy, he had introduced it, whether it would have been passed or not is questionable. But Johnson was able, Lyndon Johnson in this case, was able to leverage Kennedy's memory to get the Civil Rights Act passed, and that was huge. And likewise, he was able to use Kennedy's memory to get the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. I don't think the Voting Rights Act would have happened under Kennedy. I don't think there was a lot of, there's a lot of evidence that he was moving hard that way or that that would have really occurred to him. So we have Lyndon Johnson to thank for that. And then, of course, there's the tragedy of Vietnam. It's hard to know what Kennedy would have done, whether he would have escalated the troops to the 525,000 in 1965 that Johnson did. I suspect not. Kennedy was too suspicious of the military and his commanders to go along with that plan, in my view. But there's not any evidence that he would have withdrawn from Vietnam either. And I think that the important thing to keep in mind about both of these administrations is that one of the great common denominators is Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, who served in both administrations and in many ways drove the policy in Vietnam. So, I'm going to mess with your heads a little bit more. How about this twist? We get upset about these assassinations in part because we assume that both of these presidents would have survived through their terms and done great things to complete a first term in Kennedy's case or a second term in Lincoln's case. I'm not sure that this is a fair assumption. I think it is quite possible that either or both of these men may have died in office for natural causes. Lincoln, I think everybody has seen his photographs from 1865. 1865, he's haggard, gray, drawn. The Civil War took a great deal out of him. Whether he would have survived another 4 years is debatable. And candidly, many Lincoln scholars do not think he would have survived another 4 years. They don't think that he would have been able to see Reconstruction through. Kennedy, as many of you probably know, had Addison's disease. He was taking up to 8 different medications a day for this and related problems. And this is a disease that can be fatal, and one that is made worse by stress. I cannot imagine many jobs that are more stressful than being President of the United States during a war, even if it's a Cold War or a hot war, as we had in Vietnam. I'm not certain that Kennedy would have been able to see through at least a second term, given his health conditions. But I think there's no denying that both of these assassinations provoked great trauma among Americans, trauma that still exists in both cases. Clearly, to my mind, the arc of history bent sharply in Lincoln's case because the consequences were demonstrably far more dire than in Kennedy's. It's much harder to say what would have happened in JFK's case because he seems to have just been mastering the job. But this is what's difficult for historians. We work in a realm of what actually was, not what might have been. And yet, in the cases of these two men, it's the sense of what might have been that haunts us the most. Thank you. I think I went past my time. How bad? Oh, shoot, sorry. I hate it when people do that.
Oops, sorry. Typical of my generation, right? We'll deal with that later.
Sorry, everyone.
We are still dealing with the Kennedy assassination, I can assure you. So, one of the strengths and possible defects of doing a panel discussion is that the members of the panel may overlap and indeed may disagree. I think that's a strength. Some may think it's a weakness. But so I'm going to rehearse to some degree what has been said previously, but I'm going to focus more on two major sets of issues. That is the immediate international context after the assassination and the issue of Vietnam. Would Kennedy have taken us into Vietnam? I am the only member of the panel who had any memory of the Kennedy assassination. As one of the many here of a certain age who do remember in vivid detail where and how they heard the news that President Kennedy had been shot, I want to begin by briefly offering my memories, as we've seen so many others do today and in this week, of that terrible weekend, just before Thanksgiving. I was in Indiana University. I was just beginning my graduate studies there. I had been in an hour exam from 12:30 to 1:30, and when I walked out into the hallway, I was told by a fellow student what had happened. The news had begun to be released by the networks about 40 minutes before. And of course, then for the next few days, my wife and my friends and I sat watching television, something that we didn't do a lot of at that time, watching that very difficult weekend, culminating in Jack Ruby's murder of Lee Harvey Oswald on Sunday, November 24th, and of course the funeral of President Kennedy on Monday, November 25th. And at that time, almost all of us, of my friends and others, were convinced that this was a Soviet plot. After all, who is this guy, Lee Harvey Oswald? He has been in Russia for 3 years. He has been given, while in Russia, after getting first an honorable discharge and then later a dishonorable discharge from the United States Marine Corps, he had been given what was for the Russians, Soviet citizens, a luxury apartment in Minsk, though we now know that many of the people who dealt with him wanted to get him away, as far away from Moscow as possible. Given amenities that the typical Russian citizen had not been given, so something strange is going on, so the view was. He comes back to the United States. He goes through a series of part-time jobs, comes to Dallas, goes back to New Orleans where he'd spent a good part of his youth, gets in touch with the National Fair Play for Cuba Committee, one of the organizations, the very few organizations, trying to argue for a sane policy, as they defined it, toward Castro's Cuba. He offers himself as the head of a Fair Play for Cuba Committee in New Orleans. The National Committee declines that offer, but he then sets himself up, goes out, finds the money to print up pamphlets and leaflets and whatever, and is the one person, Fair Play for Cuba Committee person in New Orleans. So there's all of that going on as it comes out. Ultimately, several weeks before the assassination, it becomes known that he had actually gone to Mexico and had tried to get a visa to Cuba with the aim of going back to the Soviet Union, or at least that was the presumption. For many years, the CIA denied that they had any knowledge of that. Recently, there's been evidence that has come out that there were CIA documentation that did sort of track Oswald. So anyway, this all plays into, of course, the ongoing tensions between the United States and its client states, such as Cuba and the U.S. and its allies. As Jenny has mentioned, the Cuban Missile Crisis just a year earlier, when we were on the brink of war. I and my fellow graduate students had an escape plan to leave Bloomington were the missiles begin to fall. There are mixed signals in the immediate aftermath of the assassination. There are many, many rumors about Lee Harvey Oswald being a pawn of, or a tool of, or a trained assassin, which is dubious, frankly. And also, there are signals on the other side. We now know, and it became known pretty soon thereafter, that both Bobby Kennedy and Jackie Kennedy sent a message to Premier Khrushchev just a few days after the assassination, emphasizing that they did not believe the Soviet leaders had any role in JFK's death. Recently, it's been, the information has come out that Khrushchev broke down and sobbed in the Kremlin on hearing that JFK had been assassinated in Dallas. He cried again publicly while signing the condolences book. Mostly, of course, because he feared that the rumors about Soviet involvement might lead the two nations to the brink, or perhaps over the brink, of nuclear war. In 1964, Drew Pearson, and some few of you will remember with me who that journalist was, Drew Pearson, went to Moscow, and Khrushchev asked him what really did happen. And Pearson said he was killed by Lee Harvey Oswald. This is a lone assassin. This is a wingnut who, in his twisted way, thought he could somehow improve his own lot and the lot of the world by killing the president. And Khrushchev made clear he did not believe that. He did not believe that he denied strongly that the Soviet Union had any role, but he was convinced that right-wing forces in the United States, even perhaps, he suggested, the FBI or the CIA, had a role because of the view that they held that President Kennedy, as Jenny suggested, was maturing in office, that he had undertaken efforts to ease the tensions between the East and the West, and that they did not want to end the arms race, which was so lucrative, if you want to use that particular conspiracy theory, so lucrative, so beneficial to the military-industrial complex. So we don't know, really, what happened. That is, I think the panel here tonight would agree, and on the basis of all the effort that I've put in over the last several weeks to try to bring myself up to date, it's astonishing how much has come out and continues to come out. From my point of view as a military diplomatic historian, there are three huge mountains of publication in my field: the Civil War, World War II, and the Vietnam War. Well, this could be added. At least 250 books published on some aspect of the assassination, books broadly defined, I have to say. Some of them perhaps mimeographed, if any of you know what a mimeograph is. But astonishing. I mean, you know, the conspiracy theories continue to recur. The three letters, one of these books says, the three letters CIA recur over and over again in the Kennedy assassination saga, with many unanswered questions. Were the CIA mafia plots to kill Fidel Castro somehow related to the JFK murder? Did the CIA conduct a cover-up after the assassination? And that may well be true, including hiding a relationship with the assassin Lee Harvey Oswald. Was Oswald an agent of the CIA? So all of this continued to go on. There's certainly an abundance of material about Cuba and anti-Castro operations that seem to support some of this. You know, what about Cuba and the Kennedy assassination? It's a complex story, certainly. There is something to it, but as Jenny points out, historians need evidence. We need persuasive evidence from various sources, not just from one whispered, alleged, unidentified source or whatever. New books such as Someone Would Have Talked, quote unquote, and Ultimate Sacrifice provide syntheses of this new information. But it's an industry that continues to yield all kinds of products. One of the, just as an aside, and some of you may be familiar with some of these, here's a list of some of the topics on one of the more popular websites relating to the Kennedy assassination. Did JFK seal his fate with a plan to dump LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson? Wounded eyewitness challenges Warren Commission. And by the way, I think there is considerable evidence now that one of the principal purposes in the rapid creation of the Warren Commission and getting Justice Warren, who did not want the job, to take the chair in that commission, was to try to emphasize the lone gunman theory in order to cool off or play down any possibility of Soviet involvement, or Russian involvement. CIA in 1950s mirrors JFK assassination. Corsican assassin in Dallas on day of JFK was killed. John Connally debunked JFK's single bullet theory, on and on and on. Did George H.W. Bush witness the JFK assassination? What the heck that has to do with any explanation, I don't know. Okay, well, I think you can see where this goes. This is going. There are a number of books now, few books now from the Russian side that do claim to suggest that Oswald was had been trained as an assassin, but they're not treated as very credible. Many were convinced, and many of these recent works argue that right-wing leaders, such as Texas billionaire H.L. Hunt, were behind the assassination, and that Oswald was a patsy. And I might recommend to you, if you want to get a sense of what the atmosphere was in Dallas during that time, you might want to read the book by two journalists, I've forgotten their names, Dallas 1963, which really describes the city as a stew of racism and fascism and anti-Catholicism that did kind of reinforce the view that this left-wing nut may be only a patsy for other people. Okay, well, historians are not able to answer the question. I'm one of the I'm just at the front edge of the baby boom generation, so I'm going off stage sometime soon, and perhaps after that, maybe there will be more persuasive information about what did happen. I want to tackle very briefly, though, the what-if question about Vietnam. would the United States have committed itself to full-scale conflict in Vietnam had Kennedy lived? As Jenny mentioned, historians really are uncomfortable with what we think of as hypotheticals, arguments based on what might have happened. Contingency, unanticipated actions yielding unanticipated consequences play a huge role in historical change, a driving force, really, in explaining historical change. So we really need to rely, or want to rely, on the historical record and what it demonstrates, using empirical data to analyze past events. That means that so whether Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, whether he was the pawn of powerful interests, whether the Soviet Union, Cuba, the CIA, the mafia, whether that's in the unknowable for us. But I do think that the weight of historical evidence suggests that JFK remained, even though he did show signs of maturing in office, that he remained a committed Cold Warrior, and that he's not the JFK, or wasn't the JFK, that his admirers and people such as Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and people who were trying to put him on this pedestal, that he had changed sometime after he took office. There are any number of pieces of evidence that argue that he did change. It's a very interesting recent book by a fellow named James Douglas, who says that the evidence is that Kennedy did mature. Douglas is a Canadian pacifist, so that may skew him toward that view, but that he believes that Kennedy was about to resisting McNamara's, the efforts of McNamara and others to get the United States more deeply into the Indochina War, that Kennedy was resisting those pressures, and that he was even thinking about, in the weeks before going down to Dallas on that political jaunt, he was thinking about withdrawing some significant number of the then nearly 10,000, as I recall, American advisors who were in Vietnam. But we also now know that if you look at some serious historical work on this period, he didn't withdraw that withdrawal. That the minutes of the National Security Council make clear that he agreed with McNamara and others that it was important to maintain and probably to increase U.S. involvement. He was talking about, if we do this, I believe the war will be over, the conflict will be over by 1965. Sounds familiar, maybe, given recent events. If you look at the speech that he didn't give, the text of that speech is now available on the internet. It sounds very much like the inaugural speech in certain aspects. Tough. It is our obligation to carry the work, to do the work of freedom, and to take whatever risks are necessary, bear whatever costs are necessary. He does agree to expand the U.S. advisory role. There is consideration, indeed, of bombing missions by the United States, by U.S. personnel, I should say. Now, admittedly, those policy changes might not have been carried through had he lived. He might have not done what Johnson did. He might not have seized the incident, so-called incident, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, to justify ramming through congressional authorization for unlimited use of force as President Johnson did. Perhaps not, in part because he did not, as Jenny suggested, enjoy the freedom of action that his legatee LBJ had in 1964-65. Well, I could make offer much more on that point, or those points, but I now will yield the microphone to our colleague, Jonathan Hagel. And maybe somebody can get this back up. Thank you.
Poor Jeff Moran. It's not Hagel, it'll be Moran. Okay. Okay. Actually, Jeff Moran is here, and Jonathan Hagel will be on very shortly. Ted has covered a number of points that I was going to make before he got to Vietnam, but I guess I want to caution some of the people out there that we will not solve the question of who killed Kennedy and whether there was or was not a conspiracy tonight. Maybe during the Q&A we'll get to that and somebody will have the answer, the definitive answer. But the short answer is we don't quite know exactly. I have my suspicions. I'm looking at the Masons back in Freemasons. One of the first questions is Dallas killed him. And I think Ted sort of alluded to this a little bit, and kind of unfair to the city. But a lot of people are saying this. Dallas killed Kennedy. JFK, LBJ, and their wives were going down to Texas to shore up the Democratic Party in the state, and to kind of mend some of the divisions within the Democratic Party of Texas at that time, back when there was a Democratic Party in Texas. And in their itinerary was Dallas. People ask, why do you go to Dallas? This was the city where in 1960, when LBJ and Lady Bird were in a very posh hotel in downtown Dallas, a crowd surged at them. And I should note, a crowd of matrons, well-bred Dallas socialites, rushed them, spat upon them, cursed them, and they were hustled out of there. It's a city where 3 months before JFK's assassination, the ambassador to the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson, was heckled while he was giving a speech. And then again, another one of these well-bred matrons of Dallas attacked him with a picket sign outside of the theater where he was giving his talk. As Kennedy was getting close to Dallas, the day before, and then on the 22nd itself, they were greeted with pamphlets which were being handed out, wanted for treason. This man is wanted for treasonous activities against the United States, cited betraying the Constitution, turning sovereignty of the U.S. over to the communist-controlled United Nations. Some of you are old enough to remember, the way that sex education would lead to unisex bathrooms, would lead to Soviet takeover, those kinds of things, right? So there are all these connections. But these were pamphlets being handed out. The morning of November 22nd, there was a full-page advertisement in the Dallas Morning News, which was run by Ned Dealey, whose father or grandfather, Dealey Plaza, was named for. And Ned Dealey was, as you can see from this, I guess you can't really see from this, can you? It's a series of questions, sort of John Birch Society-inspired questions. Mr. Kennedy, why is Latin America either anti-communist or anti-American or communistic, despite repeated influxes of U.S. foreign aid? Why have you been throwing away our sovereignty to the Soviet Union, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Full-page advertisement that morning. Dallas, at every level, was strongly, even by the standards of Texas, strongly right-wing. And so there was a sense, when the bullets had first been fired and Kennedy was taken off to Parkland Memorial Hospital, that it might have been Dallas's fault. In fact, you remember the pictures of Lyndon Johnson taking the oath of office in Air Force One. And Jackie Kennedy is standing next to him. He made sure she was standing there. And she's still wearing her dress, this kind of lovely pink dress. It's got bloodstains on it. And Lady Bird had said, honey, shouldn't we go and get your clothes changed? And she said quite directly, no, I want them to see what they did to my husband. And it's pretty clear when she says they, she means Dallas. She means the right wing in Dallas. So for her, at least for a little while, she had no doubt about what the conspiracy was against her husband. But of course, she was joined, as Ted began to suggest, with a lot of other people who had a lot of other ideas about who might have killed JFK. Bobby thought it might be a conspiracy. Certainly Jackie thought there was a conspiracy. Johnson was intensely interested in finding out if there was a conspiracy. J. Edgar Hoover thought this little commie, who he knew about, was killing on the orders of the Soviet Union. So the Attorney General of Texas suggested that he could take care of this. If he could take care of the investigation by himself with a couple of rangers. Nicholas Katzenbach said that that wouldn't be such a great idea, LBJ. Let's take this somewhere else. And exactly as my colleague said, there's this fear that this kind of wild speculation would indeed hit upon the Soviet Union or Fidel Castro and others, and you needed to put some sort of limits on it. And so LBJ did get Earl Warren, this august figure, to agree very much against his desire to chair this commission. LBJ made it even worse. He was chairing the commission with Richard Russell, an arch segregationist, hated Earl Warren. Earl Warren hated him back, but maybe they could balance each other out in this sort of greater calculus. The Warren Commission interviewed in the neighborhood of, that's written down. It's an amazing number. Interviewed 25,000 interviews, about a similar number of pages of the reports. Secret Service did another 1,500 people. And Warren Commission report, the full report was 26 volumes. And again, this is this attempt in some ways to get to the truth of the matter, but there was also this sense by people that there had to be something bigger than the lone gunman. William Manchester talks about the need for an almost aesthetic yearning for some sort of balance, a cosmic balance of the strongest man in the world, most powerful man in the world, against what he called this wretched waif, Lee Harvey Oswald. That there's something in us that rebels against the idea that someone so insignificant could make such a difference in a balance of power in the world. And it's a kind of cosmic speculation that way. As historians, we know that there are these hinges where something very contingent, something almost random, can make a huge change. Not that there's anything random about assassinations, but there it is. So the Warren Commission report came out, 26 volumes. The press, the New York Times, embraced it. Here was the answer. That doesn't last all that long. There are some problems. I will say up front, there are problems in the Warren report. To some extent, you were right that Warren and the others went in hoping for a lone shooter, and to a large extent, they threw out evidence that didn't quite fit with their ideas, right? There's a cherry picking of evidence. You sort of keep the stuff that fits, throw away the stuff that doesn't fit. That's part of what graduate education is. We try to get them to stop doing that. Because they come in ready, they know what the answer is. We get them to stop doing that. But it's pretty clear on this commission, there's a lot of embarrassment. Hoover is embarrassed. J. Edgar Hoover is on the commission. He's embarrassed because the FBI didn't see this coming. And they damn well should have seen it coming. And they didn't really do the investigation very well. The Secret Service hadn't really done their job properly. You had a dead body to prove this. They tried to obfuscate a little bit. Hoover only gave the commission as much as he thought they should know. And then, of course, Allen Dulles, the spy master, wanted to be invisible altogether. There's a whole can of worms, of Latin American worms, that he did not want to be opened up. And so he gives the commission almost nothing. As I say, this isn't the only reason why there comes to be a conspiracy theory. Shortly after that, 1967, you get the beginnings, I would say sort of the ur-text of conspiracy theory. Mark Lane's Rush to Judgment. This really sets the tone for all the theories and all the books that are going to come afterwards. And it's a critical change. For the first time, you have a left-wing indictment of a right-wing conspiracy. Prior to this time, the right wing had the kind of market cornered on lunatic conspiracy theories. The John Birch Society, all of these other groups that thought that Eisenhower was a dupe of the Soviet Union. Now we finally got leftists saying Yeah, maybe it's the fault of the military-industrial complex and others. And certainly that's what Mark Lane thought. There's a scene in JFK where you get the Joint Chiefs of Staff sitting around plotting Kennedy's murder. And Lane was the first to really start advancing this idea. And of course, it really catches on. You get hundreds of books that go in that direction. Start saying this was indeed a right-wing coup in America, in a country we didn't really think there was such a thing. I should stop and ask for a second, how many of you believe that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone? Okay. This is a sort of heavier favor in Oswald than is common. 2/3 of Americans, after Mark Lane's book, in the next few years, came to believe that there had been a conspiracy. And that number has remained pretty consistent up until today. I don't know if many of you are wrong or more of you are right. As I said, we're not going to solve the problem today, and it's certainly not my job to solve the problem. You should know. I'm not being paid enough to do that kind of thing. So you end up getting a kind of cottage industry of assassinations. And there is, eventually, this is funny. Absolutely my favorite. I mean, to be sure, there's a slight exaggeration. But we are at this point where it's actually wonderful. The conspiracy theorists will actually take each other down. So you get somebody who thinks that the Masons killed Kennedy, and there's somebody who believes that Joe Kennedy Sr. killed Kennedy, and they sort of attack each other's evidence. You can see this. So this gives you a sense of that. But it does bring us to this issue that there are so many possibilities of who could have done it, but they don't think that the Warren Commission was correct. And over the course of time, this doubt about we're not being told the full story, that the government is hiding something from us, becomes intensified with the Vietnam War, intensified with the Watergate conspiracy, intensified by the discovery that, as Lyndon Johnson said later on in his life when he took office, he found out that Kennedy was running a goddamn Murder Incorporated down there in Latin America. There was evidence, clear evidence, that the U.S. was complicit in a lot of assassinations all over the world, starting with Eisenhower, Kennedy picking up on it. And so it's one of these ironies that in the wake of JFK's assassination, over the next decade, it plays a crucial role in the loss of faith in authority in America. This loss of faith in the government. As I say, this is kind of crowning irony, because JFK was one of these shining figures who thought government has this role to play. Government can be a force for good in America. Now, at this point, we're not so sure on this. We're at a more cynical time, and probably it's for the best that we don't take at face value when the CIA says it's doing something for our own good, when the NSA says it's doing something for our own good. A little cynicism is not a bad idea, but it does mean that we've lost this sense of faith that Kennedy had in the ability of government to work for us rather than to take us down. Thank you.
I should probably just leave this up there, but all right. I've been told that Saint Steve Jobs can solve all of my problems. So I'm going to try to make Steve Jobs make good on that in just a second. We'll see if that works. All right. So I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. I want to thank Henry Fortunato and the excellent public library staff here for putting this together. And of course, to thank Professor Moran for the invitation to come and speak tonight. My colleagues thus far have given us, I think, some wonderful examples of what historians do. We assess the impact of contingent events on deeper currents of stability and change. We like to use context to make sense of otherwise senseless acts and senseless ideas. And we take the long view. We try to determine the historical significance of things beyond that immediate moment. Like most of you, I imagine, I have been dipping into some of the commentary that has been pouring out of our mass media for the past few weeks, commentary about the Kennedy assassination. I've been impressed, actually, by some of it. I think there's some real insights that have been generated, but most of it is not historical. Most of it takes the form we might call commemoration, or remembrance. Now, I was born in 1976, so I have no direct memories of the Kennedy assassination. But what's strange about that is I have lots of memories of other people remembering the Kennedy assassination. I know where my mother was when Kennedy was assassinated. My aunts, my uncles, I know where they all were when he was assassinated. A close friend of mine who I was doing some email exchange with earlier today, he remembers the Kennedy assassination as the moment when he saw his father cry for the first time. Didn't actually remember the assassination, but it made his dad cry. With that said, I'm also a cultural historian, which is to say, among other things, that I study popular culture, where we go for entertainment, where we go for escape, where we go for leisure, where we go for fun. It's hard work, but someone has to do it. Especially in the 20th century, though, especially after World War II, popular culture is more than just fun, though. It's also the place where most of us go to find meaning, to make sense of the things that happen to us and happen in our world. Popular culture is also the place where memory is made, or at least shaped in really important ways. Popular culture is the material through which Americans have come to terms with the social traumas that have afflicted them. And make no mistake about it, the assassination of JFK was a social trauma. What might we gauge this? I was thinking of what might be a good example to get how traumatic the experience was. Compare, for instance, the outpouring of the last few weeks with, say, the 50th anniversary of FDR's death. FDR was a titan. It's probably only a slight exaggeration to say that he saved democracy, defeated fascism, and laid the foundation for the post-war middle class. Not too bad. For all of that, though, the 50th anniversary of his death passed in 1995 with little notice, at least if we judged by the impact of that commemoration on the consciousness of one 19-year-old history major, then just starting to pay attention to those things. As I began thinking about how to explain this, how to explain the outsized significance of JFK's death versus, say, someone like FDR, a question began to take shape in my mind. What are we commemorating exactly when we commemorate the anniversary of JFK's assassination? Maybe to put it slightly differently, how has the assassination and JFK himself lodged itself in our American collective consciousness? Because I study post-war U.S. history for the most part, I cheated. I called up all the people I knew who were alive then and asked them. The luxury those of us who study recent history gets that my 19th century friend, for instance, does not. The strongest recurring theme that came out of these answers, though, was this idea of loss. That this Kennedy assassination brought forward loss of possibility, loss of innocence. That word used an awful lot, innocence. That the assassination marked the end of something, the end of something. Of course, that right there is a clue for us. You can't really know that an event marks the end of something until that thing is already over. How do you know that something is the end? All right, the most telling answer I got, though, came from my mother-in-law. Yeah, believe it or not. Who, it didn't take long before she started singing this song, a song I had never heard before, which I'm now going to try to get Mr. Jobs to help us connect with. The title of the song is Abraham, Martin, and John. Oh, good. Good. Excellent. All right. Okay, so I'm going to play it. You all sing along. Let's see what we can do here. Thanks, Steve. All right, so this experience was perfect because as soon as I started mentioning this song and asking if anyone had heard it before, of course, everyone has heard it before, everyone of a certain age. You know. So I want to dig just a little bit deeper into this small piece of popular culture because I think it gives us a place to excavate. A deep American memory. It allows us to cut through some of the layers laid down by time and subsequent events. If we pay close attention to the sediments and sort of fossilized fragments of memory we pass as we dig, we may be able to learn a little bit more about how Americans coped with the social trauma inflicted by the assassination. All right, so let's start with just the production of the song. The song was written by a journeyman singer and songwriter named Dick Holler, June of 1968. He wrote it in response to the assassination, first in April of Martin Luther King, and then that June of Bobby Kennedy. The song was first recorded by Dion, which was that version right there, who that same summer of 1968, who included it in his self-titled first album. Now, I was a bit of a classic rock junkie in college, and I have to say I have nothing by Dion on my little iPad. Yeah. Dion's first live performance on television of the song was November 17, 1968. So about a week ago, 45 years ago, or put it in its proper terms, as the 5th anniversary of JFK's assassination was coming, fast approaching. The song reached number 4 on the singles chart and turned gold, which say it sold 1 million copies. It also reached number 1 in Canada. Lots of songs reached the top 10 of the pop charts, right? That's not in itself significant. As I started digging, though, a bit more about the history of the song and what happened to it, a pattern kind of emerged. In 1969, there were 3 covers. Andy Williams, a very popular show host, variety show host, and popular singer. That reached the top 40 as well. Smokey Robin and the Miracles, 1969. Their version reached number 33. Marvin Gaye covered it in 1969 as well. It was not released in the US, but did hit number 1 in the UK. And an absolutely amazing version, go home, use YouTube tonight, Mom's Mabley. I've never heard of this one. Yeah, see? She does this amazing version of it. She was a comedian before this. Her version gets to number 34, probably 35 on the Billboard Top 100. Right? She still is the oldest person to ever have a record land on the Top 100. Great thing on the Merv Griffin Show. Check it out. Harry Belafonte covered it in 1970, as did Leonard Nimoy. Over the next few decades, Bob Dylan, Sammy Davis Jr., Bon Jovi, Emmylou Harris, Tori Amos, Whitney Houston. Right? The song is covered dozens of times. All told, 5 different versions make it into the top 40. 5 different versions. Right? The only song like that. For a cultural historian, right, this is gold, right? This is my eureka moment. Clearly, when you have a text like that, it has touched a nerve, right? It has gotten deep into the currents of the American psyche. I'll just very quickly go through the lyrics of the first verse. Has anyone seen my old friend Abraham? Can you tell me where he's gone? He's freed a lot of people, but it seems the good die young. You know, I just look around and he's gone. And then it repeats about John F. Kennedy, and then there's a slight shift, and then about Bobby Kennedy as well. About Martin Luther King, and then Bobby Kennedy as well. On its face, the song makes absolutely zero historical sense. Right? It just is it's nonsensical. After all, Martin Luther King, okay, he freed a lot of people. Oh, we can go with that. That works. He had help, but it's fine. He did not die young. Lincoln, see, Professor Weber has confused me. Lincoln did not die young. Lincoln freed a lot of people, but did not die young. JFK did not free a lot of people. All right? He made a really important phone call to Coretta Scott King, one that for African Americans really took on great significance for the movement. He gave a really great speech in the summer of '68 about civil rights. Pardon me? 63, sorry, in 63. Historians confusing their dates. This is not good for our reputation. I studied cultural history. It's fine. Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King, we have to remember, in 1968 was not a beloved man. Right? For people in the moderate center, he had turned into a radical by 68 when the song is out. Right? He turned against the war. He started talking about economics and redistributing wealth. For black radicals, he was always too moderate. Right? He was a highly contested figure. Bobby Kennedy did even less than his brother. He was, at that time, when of his assassination, we have to remember, locked in a bitter political fight just for the nomination of the Democratic Party. Certainly no guarantee he would have won the presidency. Again, as history, this just doesn't make a lot of sense, this song, except to note that they were all assassinated. But it does tell us something about how memory is made, how significance is lent to events that otherwise don't make a lot of sense. We're running a little late. One of the associations in the song, right? Sticking Abraham alongside those other three men, Abraham Lincoln. I mean, the association between Abraham Lincoln and JFK was, as Professor Weber talked out, one manufactured, if you will, by Jackie Kennedy. Right? She was very conscious of wanting to make, for instance, the funeral of Kennedy look like that of Abraham Lincoln. Even the eternal flame, just something I read recently, the eternal flame that was constructed on Kennedy's gravesite, constructed in 24 hours, by the way, was something Jackie Kennedy later reported that she and John had seen on a vacation. A vacation where? Gettysburg. They went to Gettysburg. This is how Jackie Kennedy remembered this. Making JFK's funeral look like Lincoln was a choice. It was a choice that Jackie Kennedy made. And it's one that's made especially clear by Jackie's reaction to learning that Kennedy had been killed by a communist. Right? By a silly little communist is what she said. The quote is, "He didn't even have the satisfaction of being killed for civil rights. He didn't even have the satisfaction of being killed for civil rights." How odd. Kennedy had made himself into a Cold Warrior, right? His foreign policy was always first for him. Why did it matter to Jackie Kennedy that he be remembered for civil rights, be associated with Lincoln as opposed to the man who stood down the communists? Let's take that second set of associations really quickly. John, Martin, and Bobby. On its face, it makes more sense, right? They all were assassinated within a very short period. But this too was an act of meaning-making. After all, the two brothers had a complex and very contested relationship with civil rights and the civil rights movement. Bobby embraced the movement, certainly after his older brother's death. But neither one of them were killed for their stance on civil rights. Only one of those three men was. And again, the one who was, at that time, liked the least. Put these two parts together, the Lincoln and JFK part, and then the association of Bobby, John, and Martin. What do we get? I mean, at least Lincoln and King, when we think about them, they made Americans face their own dark hearts. Both men aimed to overturn the social order in the United States, and to do so for the sake of freeing a portion of the country that was not free. To line up Lincoln and Martin Luther King with Bobby and Jack Kennedy, that should make it seem to us how shallow the significance of the Kennedy brothers was. But it actually has the opposite effect. To line them up means that we line up this wonderful string of martyrs, martyrs for the great cause of American democracy, the great cause that was ongoing. We have gone very long. Why don't I'll just end there, and perhaps we can ask some questions about that. Thanks.